The first incarnation of Fleetwood Mac is not the one that is best known today. The British-American version of the band featuring Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks didn't form until New Year's Eve 1974. Today I want to talk about the first era of the band, and specifically their founder and frontman during that period, the enigmatic Peter Green. Peter Green had held the same gig as Eric Clapton, lead guitarist in John Mayall's Blues Breakers. After leaving that band, however, he decided to set up his own outfit, and so, in 1967, Fleetwood Mac was born. Fleetwood Mac grew and grew in popularity until, in 1969, according to several sources, under Peter Green's leadership they outsold the Beatles and Rolling Stones combined in Europe. But all of this success was to come to a sudden precipice in March 1970, when Peter Green announced he was leaving the band after a mysterious encounter with some shadowy figures in Munich. There are countless rumours, reports and conjectures about what happened to Peter Green in Munich. But all accounts agree, when he came back, he was permanently changed. So today I want to examine that event, the Munich incident, and try to piece together the various reports to try and make some kind of sense of what actually happened behind those closed doors. Why did Peter Green's personality permanently change? And why did his mental health break down after that visit to a German commune? But before we get into the actual Munich incident itself, we need to set the scene and understand a little bit about what was going on in the world of Peter Green and Fleetwood Mac in the preceding years. The band began a US tour at the back end of November 1968, and it was on this tour that they first tried LSD. It was being offered to them by notorious drug dealer and sound engineer for the Grateful Dead, Owsley Stanley. Mick Fleetwood remembers it this way. We ran into Owsley Stanley, of course, and decided that we were ready to try his acid. What ensued was a mind-melting experience that wasn't at all what I expected. As it kicked in, we ended up sitting in a circle on the floor, holding hands, consumed with anxiety. Each of us panicked in our own way that we were having a bad trip, and had done immeasurable permanent damage to our minds. I glanced at Peter, saw him as a skeleton, and thought he was dead. It was horrible. We were all a wreck. It never became a regular thing for all of us in the way that hash and pot and alcohol were, but Peter indulged more than most. And from this point forward, Peter Green became a regular user of the hallucinogenic drug. But, according to Dinky Dawson, who was a sound engineer on the road with the band, his personality from this point began to shift and change in strange and erratic ways. The US tour wrapped, and most of us were quite glad to be going back to England, mainly due to the weird attitude Peter was now projecting much of the time. He talked incessantly about his spiritual well-being and how music meant less and less to him, then tried to repeatedly convince the rest of the band members to give their profits away to charity. Mick Fleetwood said to me one day, "I don't mind donating to good causes, but he wants to give it all away." Friend of the band and label mate Stan Webb also said, "Peter was a very strong character, but he got into taking those weird things. When I first knew him, he'd have the occasional smoke, and that was his lot. What happened to him might well have been exactly the same as with me, because I got spiked once on LSD, which gave me a nervous breakdown and just about screwed me up for 3 years. For ages after, I would sit watching television and suddenly burst out crying. When it was done to me, I ended up on a tube train going to Kilburn Art College for a gig. Someone said hello to me, and I tried to stab them. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I ended up in this ambulance with the old blue light going, and a nurse giving me glass after glass of orange juice, as well as 3 great spoonfuls of Marmite for the riboflavin in it, which calms you down. We also had a Swiss road manager once who became deaf in one ear after he got spiked." And by all accounts, spiking with LSD happened several times to the band. At another American gig a few years later, they encountered Owsley Stanley again on January the 31st, 1970, and he spiked all their drinks just before the gig. Mick Fleetwood's other half at that time, Jenny Boyd, was one of the ones who unwittingly drank the contaminated beverages. Jenny says, "Danny Kerwin, Fleetwood Mac's young guitarist, bumped into me. 'Oh my God, Owsley spiked all our drinks,' he said. 'I don't think I can go on. I can't play my guitar.' He always looked like a schoolboy, nervous and jittery, but now he seemed worse than ever, looking at me and laughing nervously. As we gazed at the audience wandering into the hall and walking towards the stage, I noticed their eyes were glistening with bits of straw hanging from their mouths. I shook my head. The acid was getting stronger. As soon as they started playing, I made my way to the side of the stage. I watched in horror as Mick turned into a skeleton while playing his drums and had to look away. Now, before we go on, in anticipation of the pro-LSD messages I constantly get on these videos, let me just say this. I believe that some people who are very repressed or traumatized might be able to benefit under strict legal medical supervision only from treatment with LSD. Some potent Class A drugs, for example, get used in a medical situation to ease the passing of someone who is dying while on palliative care, and in that circumstance only, fair play. But I believe that there are many, many people who are already living very openly and creatively, and when those people whose minds are already open take a mind-opening drug with no valid medical reason or supervision, it pushes them into madness. This is the way I see it. Imagine a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being totally repressed and 10 being completely open, free and creative. Say someone with PTSD and terrible trauma from experience on a battlefield perhaps takes LSD medically under doctor's supervision and it moves them 8 steps up the scale. All of a sudden they're up to a number 9 and they feel transformed. But if, like Peter Green was, in my opinion, you're already at a 9 or a 10 in terms of openness and creativity, that +8 boost pushes your mind up to 17, way up into the red and off the scale, and it breaks it in a way that can never really be fully or permanently undone. And it seems that I'm not the only one who sees it that way, because Jenny Boyd said this about Peter Green at that New Orleans gig. That was the thing I couldn't really understand about Peter and drugs. That time at the warehouse gig where we all got spiked, I remember looking at Peter and thinking this wasn't natural to him because he already had his own energy and didn't need anything. They were all so high they couldn't play their instruments and were having a mass panic. At one point, Peter literally couldn't play anything. Afterwards, we were all still out of it, and I remember walking towards Peter and suddenly he said, "Oh no, stay away from me. I don't want to get caught in your world." But Jenny Boyd wasn't the only one concerned about the effect LSD was having on Peter. Dinky Dawson says, "I had to admit that Peter seemed to be spending each show more and more distracted by his own thoughts, rather than expressing himself. The more popular the band was becoming, the less interested he seemed to be about it. Privately and publicly, he'd begun to ask who he was, what God was, and how important music really was in the grand scheme of things anyway. It was tragic that Peter didn't realise or care even after being warned that doing LSD on the side didn't help resolve his conflicts. It only accelerated and inflamed them. That LSD had the power to alter your personality was the part that worried me. It was a delicate borderline that Peter had begun to tread heavily upon. Experiments with drugs had left Peter more disillusioned than traumatised or agitated, and whereas he had expected it all to liberate him and make him more carefree, it had actually made him more introverted. The constant question was, is there more? There has to be more to life than this. And this was when the religious thing started. One of Peter's nicknames in the press and amongst fans was the Green God. And around this time, he had also begun to develop a messiah complex. And that is actually pretty common of the psychotic episodes that LSD sometimes induces. The user begins to believe they actually are a god. Peter's nickname, hugely glorified reputation in the music world, fragile mental state, and regular use of LSD made him another sorry hitchhiker down this road. Towards the end of 1969, Jenny Boyd began to notice changes taking place in Peter's personality. He was almost starting to believe that he was some kind of messiah. Peter then radically changed his appearance, donning religious robes, growing long hair and a beard, as if to advertise his radical new attitudes and beliefs. Girlfriend Sandra soon grew concerned, saying, "I think psychologically it was definitely a move into psychosis, or perhaps a precursor of it. He was getting stuck into identification with God. Because of all the adoration people were giving him, He was finding it very hard to differentiate between that exalted state and mere mortality. There was a time, Peter admits, when I did start reading about Jesus and thinking along the lines of, He has returned and I am Him. Then I started reading the Bible and coming up against riddles. Why did he have red hair, supposedly, and I didn't? Then I'd remember that I did have auburn hair as a child. But it wasn't just the band and their other halves who were growing concerned with Peter's new persona. The crew were as well. We saw Peter walking across the bare stage. He'd taken to wearing a long white-robed affair with a huge crucifix dangling from his neck. Any moment it looked as though he could pick up a sword and start a fencing match, or start delivering a sermon at Mass. And during this period of religious delusion, Peter pushed harder than ever to get the band to start giving all their money away. And when the band refused, that was when the first serious fracture occurred between him and them. Mick Fleetwood says, once he realised that the rest of us weren't going to change our minds, Peter began acting crazier with each passing day. He took to wearing robes, caftans and a huge wooden crucifix. He grew his hair and beard very long, and when he spoke to the press he would only discuss his search for God. In the span of a few months he degenerated from a vibrant, confident man into a sad and fragile soul. I felt helpless and devastated watching him slip away. It felt like we'd finally found ourselves and were onto something, and all of us were ecstatic about it, all except Peter. Our popularity, our tour schedule and our record sales had the opposite effect on him. They put him into a dark, depressed cocoon of his own making. He'd started talking matter-of-factly about leaving the band, even before the single Oh Well exploded. In the end, Peter left because the rest of us didn't want to give it all away. We agreed with the beauty of his idealism, but we were practical. Our living was quite meagre. No one in the band was rich. Our dream was just to have enough saved to buy a place of our own where we could raise a family. Peter found the whole idea repulsive. He was the only one among us that wanted to live like a pauper. And so, now we've set the scene, now we've got the context, let's take a look at Munich. The band were booked to be in Munich for 3 days, but from the moment they arrived, strange things were already occurring around Peter. He met a couple of people straight from the plane at the airport who were waiting for him, who knew he was coming, seemingly by arrangement.
Certainly John McVie would fully blame an event in Germany where Peter took some more drugs and for sure never really came back from that, to our recollection, and John is to this day absolutely furious with these people. We call them the German jet set. And they captured Peter completely and pulled him away. But the reality was that Peter was already set to leave Fleetwood Mac, pretty much. But my God, this was like the final nail in the coffin.
We got to Munich airport. All of a sudden these people showed up. I don't know if it was 2 or 3. But I remember the 2 of them specifically, a very beautiful girl. I mean, like model actress looking, dressed in this black velvet, and whoa. And this guy next to her, and he looked like a John Lennon. He had his wire-rimmed glasses and a cape. And they met Pete right there. It looked like it had been arranged somehow, and it was kind of unspoken. I thought, well, maybe Mick and them know something about these people. They didn't acknowledge any of the rest of us. They were very rude.
Those 2 people were Rainer Langens, a German writer and filmmaker, and Uschi Obermeier, who was a model. She and Rainer were then in a relationship. Peter said, "We were met at the airport by this girl and boy, both of them wearing fur coats. I found myself walking with them instead of our group. It was nice for me to walk with them. They came back to the hotel with us, and there they told us that they had this commune in a big old house."
And I believe they were some sort of cult. That is what they do. They get you in and they strip you of your identity, of your belongings, of your money, and it helps them to become more powerful. And the reason I say that is because they very likely were just starting up, and Peter Green was a prime man who's making millions. And he did give off this religious look.
So the band played their first gig, and then afterwards in the dressing room, this strange couple showed up again. Fleetwood Mac's road manager Dennis Keane says, "We were in the dressing room after the gig, and a group of people came in. This always happened over there, as we were more popular in Europe than anywhere else. Amongst them was this gorgeous, really gorgeous girl. Pete was a sucker for nice chicks, and she just asked him if he wanted to come to a party. Pete said yes, but the rest of the group weren't in the mood, so only Pete and me went. Eventually, we got to this big house with a huge grand drive. So, Peter Green and his road manager, Dennis Keane, went to this huge mansion that had been rented by the Germans to take trips in.
So they came to the gig, kind of like they looked at the rest of the band in disdain. And I don't know if it was musically, they didn't think we were quite in the zone enough or whatever it was. They're very intellectual types, you know. They said, oh, there's a party we've been invited to at the this big, huge mansion place in the forest.
Dennis Keane continues, we went inside and there was a party of about 20 people sat around. We were offered a glass of wine, and the next thing I knew, all hell broke loose in my head. We'd been drugged. Nobody had offered us any tablets, they just went and spiked us. I was wandering round this house talking to people in English, and, surprise, surprise, not getting any response. I didn't have a clue where I was or what was going on. I only have one memory of Pete in the whole 24 hours that we were there. I went downstairs to the basement. They had a studio there, and I could hear all this sound coming out. So I opened the door, and there's Pete playing this guitar with all these other guys. But the sound they were making was awful. This kind of freaky electronic droning noise. It wasn't music as I knew it. It seems that Pete, in some way in that fragile mental state, with LSD added on top, kind of let go of himself a little bit at that commune. In his head there was some kind of surrender that finally happened internally, and he began making wild and crazy music, assisted by the Germans, and it seems that everyone who knew Pete before and then heard this music kind of realised what it was. It was him finally letting go and falling backwards into all the crazy. Everyone else outside of that tiny little drug-taking bubble at the commune thought the music sounded profoundly dark and disturbing. Pete himself, however, apparently enjoyed it, and when he returned to the band later on told them, that's the most spiritual music I have ever recorded in my life. Bear in mind, at this time, he was under a delusion that he was a god, that he was a messiah. I wonder if him saying, this music was the most spiritual thing I've ever made, was in some way him saying, this is my revelation. This is the revelation of the Green God. Years later, as a very fragile LSD survivor in recovery, Peter said this. While I was at the house, I remember playing lead guitar. There was a kit of drums and an electric piano. Some of it got recorded and I kept the tape. It was different and good. One of my favourites, this LSD tape, which many years later I gave to my wife in Los Angeles. And so we have the first two things that happened to Peter and Dennis at the Munich commune. They rolled up and were given wine spiked with an unknown but very, very potent LSD-like substance. Peter, stoned out of his mind, then went down to the basement and began creating what he called spiritual music, whilst under the delusion that he was a messiah. And then, after he had created what he calls the LSD tape, he just sat down to think and to process everything, and he saw himself in that moment as being made entirely out of jewels. Peter said to Mojo, we played some music for a while. Then I just sat around thinking and thought about everything. I was thinking so fast I couldn't believe how fast I was thinking. And I ran out of thoughts. I must have been thinking solid for about an hour, just sitting down on my mattress. I was put to bed by this girl. I was just lying there on my own on a mattress and thinking I was made up of crystals. Some people might be frightened to sleep if they felt like that, but I was so tired I just went straight off to sleep. All in all, apparently, Peter and Dennis were there for about 24 hours. But during that time, the rest of the band had started to become seriously worried. Dennis too had decided it was time to get out of there. He was getting a bad feeling from the whole thing. But something had snapped in Peter's mind. This kind of surrendering to the madness had occurred, and Peter had now decided he was not going to leave the commune. The psychosis had now become his reality, and he was embracing it.
Dennis Keane, I have some recollection of him being somewhat trying to be the responsible sort of road manager guy. It's like, come on, it's time to go. But in truth, they started sort of getting to us as well.
And then, as like anything else, it wears off, and if you can wear off with it, then you know what's going on, you're aware of it. And that's immediately I said, well, we got to get out of here. And I didn't know where we were. But when we used to play Europe, I'd always have a box of matches or the key of the hotel, so I knew. That's how I phoned the manager up and said, you've got to come down and get us out of here.
Dennis returned to a scene of panic amongst the band. Everyone knew Peter was right on the edge, and now he'd gone missing. Dinky Dawson says, Mick came up to me and asked, have you seen Peter? The last time I saw him, he was talking to 20 people here, I replied, but Dennis was with him too. Well, Mick replied, what about Dennis? Has he been around? I replied, not since then, come to think of it. Mick walked away muttering. Arriving back at the hotel after a couple of hours, I walked in to find the band members in a serious meeting with the local promoter and 2 Munich policemen. Peter and Dennis were still unaccounted for. After taking notes, the officers left and we made plans to hit all the known night spots in our own search. But before we embarked, Dennis suddenly reappeared. Where is Peter? Clifford almost screamed at him. He wouldn't come back with me, the roadie moaned. I tried, but he didn't care. He told me to go away. Well, you're going to take me back there right now, Mick announced, his eyes boring a hole into Dennis. If we don't get him now, we're going to lose him. And so, a group of band members and crew went back to the mansion to find Peter. And apparently when they got there, the music Peter had been recording was being played back so loud that they could hear it coming up the stairs from down below.
So we're driving into there and finally we come to this place. And it was a kind of hippie commune sort of thing, with weird stuff going on in all the rooms. Arrived there, I got out of the van. Dennis Keane comes walking up to me, he's shaking in his boots. And he was stoned too. He comes up to me and he goes, it's so weird out there, don't go down there, Jerry, don't go down there. Pete is weirding out big time. The vibes are just horrible, you know. But it was really weird. And the music coming up from below, down there, it was bad news. So Pete says, so what do you think of my playing then? You know, and I said, Pete, it was shit. It sounded like out of the pits. But he said, well, okay, that's what you think. He said, that's the most spiritual music I've ever played in my life.
Dinky Dawson says, we walked in and immediately stumbled into a nude photo session that was going on in the front living room. We excused ourselves and wound through the mansion's maze of hallways until we finally found Peter lying in a sunken den that was padded generously with huge cushions and bathed in various psychedelic lights. He was obviously tripping on some very potent LSD, and Mick had to carefully explain to him what was going on. His German benefactors countered by telling us that Peter's free spirit would make up its own mind and surely choose to stay there forever. Dennis yelled bitterly at the Germans to shut up, then confused them completely with a string of foul-mouthed Cockney curses. In the meantime, I was astounded at the strength Mick Fleetwood displayed to persuade our guitarist to come back with us. He would absolutely not take no for an answer. Only after a long negotiation were we able to induce Peter to return with us. So, after Mick Fleetwood pleaded with him, Peter Green finally agreed to come back with the band. But he and Dennis were still clearly not right and behaving very, very strangely indeed in the car ride back.
A couple of times I'd look and he'd be sitting in the back of the car with Danny, and he'd like this, and Danny would do it, and he would be on the other side, but it's like this together, and I can't remember how this. Like they were locked in something together, and it wasn't good.
I wonder what was really, actually, in that spiked wine. All these guys in the band and the crew had used LSD before, and they all seemed shocked and slightly horrified at the reactions of Pete and Dennis. So, whatever it was they'd been spiked with, it certainly wasn't standard stuff. And isn't it interesting what the Germans said to the band and the crew when they were trying to rescue Peter? His free spirit would make up its own mind and surely choose to stay there forever. I wonder if they were saying things like that to him when he was lying there stoned in his mind-blown state. I wonder if they said things to him that actually reinforced his delusions. Dennis, the only other person from the crew who was there, said, "For all I knew, during the time that I was out of it, they may have been drumming something into Peter. They might have been saying, 'You've got all this money, you should be giving it away.'" In Peter's case, he started to go down after Munich. As the tour bus travelled on from Munich the next day, he told the band of his decision to leave. Dinky adds, "The person we brought back to the hotel would never again be the man I'd known. One moment he'd express mellow sentiments of peace and love, the next second he'd hurl a torrent of screams and curses at anything." And Mick says, "Peter was in a panic like we'd never seen before. He'd start talking about the money we were making and then just mumble, repeating himself endlessly. He'd get worked up, upset and inconsolable, and then go into a paranoid, feeble panic. He kept saying that he was simple, he was working class, and the money we made was too extravagant. 'The money, I don't want it,' he'd say. 'The money, it's an anchor around my heart. It drags me into darkness.'"
Both of them, as of that day, became seriously mentally ill. I think it's too much of a coincidence for it to be anything other than taking drugs. It's as of that day, and I think if you speak to Mick and John and Jeremy, they would tell you exactly the same story. You know.
For me, yeah. I think that was the fork in the road. Buggers.
Peter still had a few commitments to fill with the band, after which he left Fleetwood Mac behind. But the terrible baggage he had acquired since starting using LSD followed him home, mentally and in person. A few of the German hippies who'd got a hold of him followed Peter back to London and moved in with him, where they continued to trip on acid together. Peter grew more erratic and started talking about his unclean money with the same zeal with which he once spoke about Christ. He was coming undone, and every bit of it can be heard in Peter's last single with Fleetwood Mac. His swan song was a pulsating stab of blues rhythm chords topped with howling solos that he called the Green Manalishi. The tune is about the devil, the darkness within, and the alluring temptation of descending into madness. Peter spent much of his time after Fleetwood Mac living as a recluse. He was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is actually not uncommon amongst LSD casualties. He also underwent electric shock treatment in the 1970s. He remained on medication for the rest of his life, pretty much a broken man.
Peter Green, was my brother. The doctor said he was definitely schizophrenic, and they put him onto drugs to try and level him out. He made himself a recluse in his own property, where he lived in a little house in Richmond. He sort of went from bad to worse.
He was very introvert. Had a lot of problems communicating with people. Spent many hours alone. He didn't wash, he didn't cut his fingernails. I think he ate when he was hungry. And lived in squalor.
However, Peter did eventually return to music and was able to look back, albeit blearily, on what happened to him and give his understanding of why it happened.
I don't think I was there. I think I just took too much LSD. And when I had tranquilizer, ECT, that became like a little... Tranquilizer attacks your body in some way that you just can't keep your eyes open. You can only keep your eyes open. You can't think. You know your name, but you really just know one nothing. Just like the flesh. Terrible stuff. It's ever so strong. But LSD, when you take LSD, you haven't got anything like any innards. You ain't got nothing like that. You just got your sensitive responses. If you come under attack, you allow it to happen. And then when it stops, you then see what the infiltration is. Regrettable. I wouldn't take it again if I had the chance.
But it wasn't just the drugs. I believe from other comments he makes in this same interview that Peter came to view his breakdown as a result of two things combining. Everyone constantly praising him, telling him he was a god, and LSD blowing his mind open so that on some level he came to actually believe it literally. And as a result of these two things, for the remainder of his life, Peter remained very, very wary and distrustful of praise and compliments, not because he thought badly of the people giving them, but because he blamed excessive praise as having been one part of the thing that ended up wrecking his mind and his life. Of course, he didn't want that to ever happen again, and so for the rest of his life he remained very much on guard against any kind of compliment or praise.
He always feels it's quite a big responsibility for him, and he doesn't really believe that he's as great as everybody else thinks he is. He's never really quite accepted that all these hundreds of thousands of people around the world look up to him for his music, his guitar playing. He finds that very difficult to accept. Peter himself, not long ago, said, "I know I'll never be the full shilling." Who's to say that, those problems won't come back again?
I have to watch out for people who give paying you false compliments, don't you? Trying to see if they can make you go up on a cloud. That's what happened to me, I think. That's what happened to me. I went up on a cloud and I thought I was better than I was. I kind of, went up on success. I accepted their compliments and see where I ended up.
Peter Green passed away in 2020, and I can't help but look back on what happened to him with just such a sense of fury. We were, all of us, robbed of what might have been. But it's not just that we were robbed of another genius prodigy who could have been the biggest and best musician on the planet. It's also that he was robbed, as were his family, by bloody drugs and the people pushing them. He joined the list of genius musical artists whose lives were destroyed by LSD, alongside such greats as Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd and Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who also specifically points to LSD as one of the major culprits in his own complete meltdown and loss of the majority of his functional adult life. Peter Green's work with Fleetwood Mac was absolutely groundbreaking and fantastic, and he should have been able to reap the rewards, the praise, and the money for the huge contribution he made to the happiness of the world through his songs. And the lesson is this: don't be tricked, don't allow yourself to be manipulated, don't be gullible, and certainly don't be some fucking idiot who walks down that road willingly. Stay clean and protect this, because it's the only part of you that really is you.
I say that a lot when people say, how did you go to it? I say, well, it had its high points, had its high moments, high points, high spots, point spots.
So what's the future for Peter Green?
You tell me. You're the observer. What do you think? How do you see it?
Onwards and upwards, mate.
You what?
Onwards and upwards.
Onwards and upwards. Yeah, I suppose. I suppose onwards and upwards.